Good morning folks. Today we're standing pretty much right in the high altar of Croxden Abbey in Staffordshire. It's literally just down the road from where we just were in the last video in Checkley, and we're now looking towards the end of the nave and standing in the church of what was the Cistercian Abbey here. Now you find me actually very unprepared because I completely forgot how close we were to this place when we were in Checkley, and I came here completely on a whim. But it's a nice day, and I've just done a quick bit of reading and I'll try and fill you in on some of the details. Now, Croxden Abbey was, as I mentioned, part of the Cistercian order, founded in Cister in France. I believe it was 1098, and the abbey here was actually founded in 1176 by the local noble Bertram de Verdun, who was a Norman who had Norman ancestors who came over during the time of the Norman conquest. And like many nobles at the time, he founded an abbey very much for the salvation of his soul. So it was good to be a benefactor of an establishment that was going to pray for your well-being and the well-being of your family. Actually, the original site was just down the road in a place called Cotton, but it was moved here about 3 years after its founding because this area was more remote with a bit better farmland, as the Cistercians were quite noted for being sheep farmers and they needed quite a lot of land to sustain this. So it was started here in 1179, and the church was the first building to be constructed. At first it probably was nowhere near on the scale of this, because the abbey reached its peak probably in around about 1250, when it was home to some 70 monks at its height, and then it was probably the big bustling abbey that we see now. And I'm going to pick up the camera and we're going to take a walk around the site, because it's, as you can see, it's completely in ruins due to Henry VIII. We have Henry VIII to thank for that. And the place was demolished in 1538 as part of the dissolution of the monasteries during the establishment of the Church of England. But you can still see much of the outline as it's been excavated, and there are a few nice little bits that are intact and a few nice features as well, and we're going to take a look around. Okay, so right now we're back on the high altar again, looking at some stone sarcophagi of various shapes and sizes. If I move it round here, you can see one that was obviously that of a child, and if we pan around again, some more adult size ones that are found right on the high altar. I'm not entirely sure if they were here originally, but it's looking likely because they're very well embedded in the floor, and these probably originally would have had covers on top of maybe alabaster, or maybe just like stone coffin lids, like the kind that we saw in Biddulph the other day. Okay, at this point we're going to cross over the road to the main bit of the site, which is on the other side of the road. The road sort of goes right through the middle of it, so bear with me. Okay, just while I'm here, I'm going to do a quick pan. We're looking now at the only remaining bit standing of the area around the high altar. I'm just going to pan across so you can sort of tell the scale. You can see where the arch sort of starts to go over there, and if we turn round, those are the sarcophagi we were just looking at, and this just here is probably the other wall of the church. So in terms of scale, we're not sort of on like Fountains Abbey or Furness Abbey sort of scale, which were home to much more large numbers of monks. But nonetheless, it probably was fairly impressive at its time and quite ornate. Okay, now we're going to cross over the road. Okay, so now we're standing in what would have been the chapter house originally. We're looking through now at what would have been the cloister, and now at the wall of the church that we were just standing in. Over the road just there is the high altar. Okay, so now we're going to walk through this little passage over here. The building that you see in front of me would have been the dormitory originally, where the monks would have slept. Now we're just going to go through the passage. Take a look now at the dormitory. there probably would have been a staircase somewhere as well. Just here, and you can sort of see the scale of this if you can imagine in your mind's eye where them arches would have met at the end there. Continuing through. Okay, so now we're standing looking down the cloister, the sides of which probably would have been a covered area. And you have to remember that the Cistercians were an enclosed order of monks, so they weren't really permitted, except on special permission, to leave the site. So this is where they would have taken fresh air and probably would have taken exercise. So we're looking now across the cloister at what would have been the main church building. Over there would have been the chapter house, where the abbot would have gone about his daily business. Now this site these days is actually private property. It is open to the public, but it's not owned by the National Trust or anything like that. So all the work that's being carried out on it is private. So they ask that you do show respect as you're walking around the place, because it does cost a lot to upkeep. So we look around the outer walls of the cloister. Now it's believed in this corner, although not much of it standing anymore, would have been sort of the storehouses and where they would have kept the food, and also maybe some of the farm buildings. But these plans have been, well, the bits that are standing have been lost now. Although the foundations have been sort of excavated, so they have a good idea of what everything would have looked like. Okay, so we're looking through now to the little chapel just at the side of the main church building, and this would have functioned as the library, and it would have also been where they'd keep the communion vessels and the stuff for the high altar. Okay, so we're standing in what would have been the choir area of the church, probably, or the nave more accurately. The choir probably would have been just behind me where the cross design meets, and we're looking at the back wall. And now at this point you'll start to see similarities from other more well-known Cistercian abbeys that you've been to. This looks very much like the end wall of Fountains or Revo or Furness, and it's because they sort of developed over time. They sort of developed the same plan. It was sort of like a standardised plan, although the decor varied somewhat depending on what sort of funds were available. And the big tall windows there would have been decked out in sort of stained glass, and it would have looked very impressive at the time. And it all would have been supported by arches of that kind there. It would have been a very, very impressive building, and by the 1250s this is what it would have looked like. At first Cistercian abbeys were built very much with the idea of poverty in mind, so they were very, very simple. There was no stained glass, the windows were all open, and they lived under very, very harsh conditions, closely adhering to the rule of St. Benedict. And that was Bernard of Clairvaux's initial idea during the founding of the Cistercian order, as he sort of established it. And over time it very much developed into this way, where the ideals of the era sort of changed. Apparently it became better to worship God through decadence and building huge monuments to his glory in the manner of the Abbey of Cluny, which originally the Cistercians absolutely despised. But over time their ideals sort of merged, and this kind of thing is what we ended up with by the 13th century. And because the lawnmowers are getting very near to me now, I'm going to stop the video at this point. So this has been Croxton Abbey, just outside of Uttoxeter, very near to Checkley, very near to Alton Towers, and thank you very much for joining me. Okay, I'm going to quickly try and film this before the lawnmowers come back again, because they're just behind me. What we're looking at now would actually have been the infirmary, so the hospital of the abbey, which is quite a common feature in Cistercian abbeys, so try and walk away from the noise. We're standing now in what would have been the sick room, essentially. And Cistercian monks were quite well versed in medicine, and yeah, it was usually the monastic orders who probably had the most knowledge of medieval medicine at the time. And we're looking over now at the Abbey's building. I'm going to stop the video because the lawnmower's back again. Okay, so we're looking now from the other side at the infirmary, and if I move round we can see what's left of some of the old waterworks. Now these are not as complete as perhaps they are at Furness Abbey or Fountains Abbey, but you can see like what would have been, you know, the drains or the supply of water for the monastery. Of course, monasteries were entirely self-sufficient, or they tried to be best they could, so they needed all sort of mod cons at the time. We're looking over now through what would have been the abbot's house towards the cloister and the dormitories, and the little bit on the left just there would have been the latrines, so that's why the waterworks sort of passed under there. It would have been the toilets essentially, and they would have had sort of a quite advanced flushing toilet system, much like Fountains and Furness. Now if we look at the side, this was quite a late building in the abbey, and this would have been the abbot's residence. Now originally the abbot was supposed to set the example. He was supposed to be the firm upholder in the belief of poverty and simplicity, and you can see by the 1250s all that had gone sort of out the window, because the abbot's building was quite an ornate area with stained glass, quite a large building. So yeah, you'd have been in no doubt who the abbot was at that stage. If I just pan round, over there is the visitors' entrance, where there's information and a couple of old bits and pieces of the crosses and relics and all that sort of thing. We're looking behind at the wall of the church, and that little bit just over there is the upright of the high altar, or the end of the church that would have housed the high altar, over the other side of the road. Okay, so I know I've ended this video once already, but now we are going to end, having seen the more functional side of the monastery. So thank you very much for joining me.